glad. Yeah. You're ready to go, and I'll tell people to take their seats. Testing 1, 2. If we could have everyone take their seats, and we'll start with the next program, please. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to get started with the next program, and it is my honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Louis Picone. We became friends through the Cherry Blossom Festival, and that is just such a great benefit from this festival of how many friends that you make while you're here. And it's like old home days when you come back. So we're so happy to be here live again, and the last time that we were here 2 years ago when Louis and I first met, I presented him with the Ella Dickey Award for his book, The President is Dead. And he now has a new book out on Grant's tomb, which we're going to hear a lot about in a few minutes. But I just wanted to say in the 2 years I've known Louis, we became great friends, great colleagues, and it's been a pleasure. And in that 2 years, he's really become my favorite historian author. His books are terrific. So we're going to let Louis get on with it, but ladies and gentlemen, Louis Picone.
Thank you, Larry. Let me thank Larry for that very warm introduction. We met, I think it was probably 2 years ago, probably today, in this room. And like Larry said, we've just become great friends. And Larry is also a fantastic historian, too, so please check out his books. There's a couple other folks that I'd like to just welcome and thank. First, Reverend Inman, for once again inviting me back to this incredible festival that is really tough to describe when I get home to tell my friends about. It's just really wonderful. I'd like to welcome my Marshfield family, not my host family, but my Marshfield family, Gary and Nancy Dollins, for coming today. It's so nice to see you again. And I'd also like to welcome Kyle Rocket and his wife, who traveled. I've been friends with Kyle for several years on social media, but it's our first time meeting today, as with so many other people. It's just, it's so great to be here, so thank you very much. So today I will be talking about my newest book, which is Grant's Tomb, The Epic Death of Ulysses S. Grant and the Making of an American Pantheon. So let me start off by asking, has anyone here been to Grant's Tomb? Wow, that's really impressive. I think if I did this talk in New Jersey, I'd get less hands up there. So it's really great that so many people have been there. When I spoke a couple years ago, and I was talking to Jana about this earlier, I'd mentioned that when I was younger, my father took me to all these historic places, and that kind of, like at the time, it was like, oh, Dad's dragging us to Gettysburg again. Let's just get to Disney World or get to Busch Gardens or something. But he really planted a very slow-growing seed that became my love of history. It took a couple years, a couple decades maybe, to really flourish, but it definitely goes back to my mom and my dad. Although, even though I was born in New York City, and probably 2 miles as the crow flies from Grant's Tomb, Grant's Tomb is really not a place that my father would have taken us to in the 70s or the 80s or even the early 90s. And I'm going to explain why. It's going to become more apparent as we go on. But I do want to get it out of the way because many people, the first person they think of, also I'm on the board of the Grover Cleveland Birthplace too. I wanted to mention that too. The first people, or the first person that they think of when they hear the name Grant's Tomb isn't always, as it should be, a Ulysses S. Grant. For many people, it's this guy right here. Groucho Marx. And so everyone knows the joke or the line, "Who's buried in Grant's tomb?" Although Groucho Marx first said this in the 50s, it depends on who I talk to. For so many people that I've mentioned that I wrote a book about Grant's tomb, this is the first thing that they'll say. Well, who is buried in Grant's tomb? And they all think it's kind of like the first time that I've heard that line, even though it's like every other person says that to me. And it's unfortunate. And it's interesting because some people know that Groucho said the line. Other people don't even know that Groucho Marx is the origin of the joke, or they don't even realize it's a joke. They're like, well, who is buried in Grant's tomb? Like, there's some mystery, like someone else is buried in Grant's tomb and it's not Grant. So first of all, I want to say, too, because I've come to hate this joke. I love Groucho Marx, but I hate this joke. And I just got to get it out there. Groucho Marx stole the joke. So I found footage from 1933. Little cute Shirley Temple is saying the exact same joke on a short called Dunkin' Donuts. So look it up. It's in my footnote. So Groucho Marx stole the joke, and he also stole a little bit of the identity of Grant's tomb, but luckily it's coming back. So Grant's tomb is not just a story of an architectural wonder, which it is. And for those that have been there, you know that, you've seen it. It's just an awesome, awe-inspiring sight when you see it in New York City. For those that haven't been there, after the pandemic it ends, put it on your bucket list because it really is a must-see. But the story of Grant's tomb isn't just an architectural story. I'm not an architectural historian. It's a story of people. And the first person, obviously, is Ulysses S. Grant. So in the early 1880s, now Grant had left the presidency 1877. By the early 1880s, it was the Gilded Age, and Grant was the most popular man in the country, bar none. Now, the country was still greatly divided. This is only one generation after the Civil War. And some people might think, yeah, the Civil War ended, North and South, boom, they were together again, and it was all harmony come the day after Appomattox, but that's not what happened. The country was still greatly divided 20 years later. It was divided economically, it was divided socially. But Grant was perhaps the one man in America that was beloved by both the North and the South, by Democrats and Republicans, by men and women. He was perhaps the one figure, kind of like George Washington was so many years earlier, that could bring the whole country together. In the North, he was a savior of the Union. He was twice president. He had liberated 4 million enslaved people. And during Reconstruction, he had destroyed a budding KKK that was forming in the South to strip African Americans of their rights during Reconstruction. Completely decimated the KKK. The KKK that people know now had formed about probably 50 years later after the Civil War. It wasn't the KKK that had formed during Reconstruction. Grant took care of that. In the South, he was the magnanimous and generous victor. Not just at Appomattox, though. Grant never forgot that his enemy were Americans. They were rebellious Southerners, but they were still Americans. And it wasn't just Appomattox. It was all throughout the war that he treated captured Southern soldiers or Southern citizens with respect and with generosity. But Grant was never an apologist for the South, and he considered the lost cause a revisionism that would come to play in later years and impact his legacy. He considered the lost cause a revisionism nonsense and placed the reason for the war solely on slavery. In his memoirs, he had said, "The cause of the Great War of the rebellion against the United States will have to be attributed to slavery." He was unequivocal. He was also perhaps the most popular man in the world at the time, because after leaving the presidency, Grant and Julia embarked on a 2.5-year trip throughout the world. He was in Africa, he was in Asia, he was in all the empires and the nations of Europe, and everywhere he went, he was greeted as this hero. He met with royalty, and he was greeted as a liberator of the enslaved African Americans in America. So in 1884, Grant was on top of the world. He was healthy, he was wealthy, he was famous, he had everything. But 1884 was For 1884, for Grant, it was almost like for all of us 2020. It was just a horrible year. He began the year healthy and wealthy. By the end of the year, he was bankrupt and had inoperable throat and mouth cancer. In May, Grant had realized that he had fallen victim to a financial scheme that would later become known as a Ponzi scheme, or perhaps today is a Bernie Madoff scheme. And he was not only bankrupt, he was deeply in debt. He was about $150,000 in debt. Just several months later, he was diagnosed with inoperable throat cancer. And cancer in 1884 was pretty much a death sentence. So Grant knew that his time was limited. And he embarked upon his final, incredibly gallant battle to ensure financial security for his family before he died. He knew his time was limited. So how was he going to do that? Now, for years, publishers had been after Grant to publish his memoirs. By this point, Civil War memoirs had become somewhat of a cottage industry. And everyone from privates to generals was publishing their memoirs, but not Grant. And publishing houses were after Grant like he was like the white whale. He was who everyone wanted to hear from. But Grant was a very humble person. Despite all of this greatness that he had achieved all throughout his years, he was very humble. And one, he didn't think he was a very good writer. He was also didn't believe that people really wanted to read his memoirs, that they felt that what he had to say wasn't that important. It's hard to believe. But also, he didn't need the money because he was wealthy. But now, this was what he believed was his option to secure that financial well-being for his family. So he embarked upon his really one of the greatest battles of his life, in his final battle, to complete his memoirs before what's been called the ultimate deadline, before he dies. So every day, Grant would sit in his New York City brownstone, which is on 66th Street, and he'd write his memoirs. He began in November, and his health very quickly started to fail. So he was in pain, he was suffering, he was struggling to speak, so then he'd write his notes on paper. But he was persistent in writing his memoirs. That Easter Sunday, 1885, what would be Grant's last Easter Sunday, he was dozing by the fire, and as he slept, thousands of people had gathered outside of his home. Once it became known that Grant was sick, at first, the family tried to keep it secret, but once it became known, just thousands of people just would gather outside of his home just to catch a glimpse of him, or just to let Grant know that they were there to support him, to show their respects. So that Easter Sunday, he dozed by the fire, and when he woke up, he saw thousands of people gathered outside of his home. And just think of this. He turned to his doctor and he said, "What a beautiful day it is." The doctor told him how fond that all of those people gathered there were of him, and Grant had said, "I am very grateful for them, very. I am sure I should like to let them know that I am appreciative." So while months earlier, Grant felt that his writing was inferior, now it was really the only way that he can communicate. So he took his pen to paper. And a day before, Grant had received a very friendly and condolatory letter from former Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Now, as Grant took his pen to paper, he thought of Davis and he thought of those Confederates. And he wrote his message to those who have not hitherto been, he wrote his message to his friends as well as those who have not hitherto been regarded as friends. His Easter message, as it became known, was printed in newspapers across the globe, and especially in the South, it was received with particular sympathy. And this was perhaps the opening salvo in the spirit of reunification and reconciliation that became a hallmark of Grant's final months, as well as his funeral and his tomb. So I mentioned that Grant's tomb is a story not just of a tomb, it's a story of people. And two of these people come from right here in Missouri. So there's one other person that I'd like to welcome who is Ulysses Grant Dietz. So Mr. Dietz and I live about 30 minutes away from each other in New Jersey. But because of COVID, we haven't actually met each other until we gathered here in Marshfield yesterday. So another Marshfield miracle. So So I had the privilege of interviewing Mr. Dietz for my book, and one of the things from speaking to Mr. Dietz, as well as reading the newspaper clippings and listening to his speeches at Grant's tomb, is that he always brings up that the tomb is not just one person in that tomb, that it's not just his great-great-grandfather is his tomb, it's his great-great-grandmother, Julia. And Julia was Grant's beloved wife. They married August 22nd, 1848, 150 years to the day before I married my Francesca, which I thought was just fantastic when I found that out as I was researching it. Not only do I start to look like Grant with a beard, but we've got the same anniversary. So Julia is from St. Louis and was the great love of his life and stood by his side, helped him out in every way, whether it was writing or making him more comfortable throughout this final ordeal. It's really one of the American presidency's greatest love stories between Grant and Julia. And the other one, I mentioned that, that Grant was the most popular man in the country at the time. Perhaps Mark Twain from Hannibal, Missouri, was the second most popular man in the country at the time. And he was the one that actually coined the phrase Gilded Age. So how come Twain is so important to this story? Well, I mentioned that after Grant found out that he had inoperable cancer, that he decided to publish his memoirs. Now, what he did was, directly from the doctor's office, he went to Century Magazine Publishing, which he had done some articles for over the years about specific battles, and he went to Century, or he went to Century, and he sat down with, at the publishing house, and he told them that he wanted to write his memoirs. They were thrilled. They've been after Grant for years, and now Grant's coming to them. They offered Grant a contract. Thank goodness Grant didn't sign on the dotted line right there in the office. He brought it home, and a couple days later, he met with his good friend, Mark Twain. Over the years, they had become friends, which is kind of ironic because Twain had served briefly in the Confederate Army, but Twain had called himself Grant Intoxicated. He just loved Grant. Twain was also starting his own publishing company, which was Charles L. Webster and Company. So Twain said, let me see the contract. And despite Grant's fame and stature, they basically offered him a contract that they'd offer pretty much anyone else that came in the door. I like to think that they would have given Grant the same contract they would have given me if I walked in the door. So Twain is like, that's ridiculous. You're the most important man in the country. Publish your book with me, and I'll make sure that you have financial security. So the first book published by Charles L. Webster was Huck Finn. The second one was Grant's memoirs. As Grant continued to write, his health continued to fail. And as the summer heat became oppressive in New York City, if anyone's been to New York, the summers are hot there, even 1885. One of his friends offered his cottage in upstate New York in this town called Mount McGregor, which is just north of Saratoga Springs, for Grant to go there to write and hopefully heal from the therapeutic air up there. So on June 16th, 1885, Grant boarded the train from Mount McGregor, and there he continued to write. But he knew that his end was near, and he tried to discuss funeral plans and burial plans with his family, but Julia, understandably, couldn't even speak about the thought of life without her beloved Ulysses. So Grant wrote out his options, and he discussed them with his family. He had a cemetery plot in St. Louis, so that was one of the options. There was Illinois, where he lived. There was West Point, where he had graduated, and New York City. And the reason for New York City, he said, was because they had shown me such kindness during my final illness. And he'd lived there for about 4 years. So Grant made his options known and then gave them to the family to make the ultimate decision. Now, the doctors were concerned. Grant was so focused on writing that the doctors were concerned that this is the only thing keeping him alive. That once Grant finishes his writing, that he's gonna lose the reason to live. Now, on July 19th, Grant finally put the finishing touches on his writing. His book, his memoirs, were 400,000 words. Now, I added up all the words that I wrote in all 3 books, which took me about 13 years to write, and it's about 410,000 words. It's just astronomical. It's hard to believe how much effort he put into, how much writing he put into his memoirs. Not only is it a complete account of the Civil War from his perspective, it's widely considered to be the best presidential memoir ever written, from Washington to up to Joe Biden. It's considered the best. Now, it's not actually a presidential memoir because he really focuses on his Civil War years, but it's just astounding. Not only did he win the battle for financial security, but he also wrote this literary and historic masterpiece. So I mentioned that July 19th, Grant finishes his writing. July 23rd, 4 days later, Grant passes away. So now the question was, where would Grant be buried? Now the decision was for the families to make. It was ultimately for his widow, Julia's, to make. Now, Julia, as we know, chose New York City, so I won't put any mystery behind that. But why did she choose New York City? One, it's because that's where she lived. She can go visit him. She can go visit the grave. So just practically. The most important reason was because she could be by Grant's side. She can be by her husband's side. And that was, Grant was adamant that wherever he was buried, Julia must be beside him. And that couldn't be the case in West Point. It couldn't be the case in Arlington Cemetery or the old soldiers' home, any sort of other national ground where the public really felt that's where Grant should be. Save the Union, he should be on national ground. But New York City made sure, they promised that Julia would be right there by his side, so the family chose New York City. And I'm going to talk about that more later. So the next question is, what kind of funeral would they have for Grant? Now, we just talked about in the presidential inaugurations panel discussion about how the traditions of America have grown over time. And that's the same with funerals. Just very briefly, George Washington had asked in his will for no funeral. He said no funeral oration. Just imagine that. Think about the presidential funerals that we have now, these multi-day affairs where millions of people watch on TV and attend in person. George Washington said he wanted no funeral. Now, why is that? Because he believed in Republican virtues, that the leaders of America, the leaders elected by the people, were different from the monarchs and the dictators, where there was multi-day funeral events. So ultimately, George Washington was a Freemason, so the Freemasons asked if they can hold a modest funeral for George Washington, what they did. So a few hundred people attended George Washington's funeral. This grew over time. On August 8th, 1885, Grant was so beloved throughout the country that it was the largest funeral in American history up to that point. In New York City, there was 60,000 marchers, mostly Union, some Confederate soldiers also marched. Again, that spirit of reconciliation. 60,000 marchers marched 7 miles throughout the city. 1.5 million people came to see the funeral of Grant. This was a time when the population of New York City was about 1.2, 1.3 million. And the epitaph for the day on banners and signs and in speeches was Grant's 4 words that he first spoke when he was running for president: "Let us have peace." Just think about that. The great warrior generals, most important words, the words that really became to personify him, were "let us have peace." So Grant was placed in a temporary tomb in Riverside Park, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. I just want to point out, so this is the temporary tomb, kind of looks like a pizza oven, but it was only temporary. So the great Grant wasn't going to have to be in a pizza oven for very long. Now, standing right here is President Grover Cleveland. Now, Grover Cleveland had just entered office just several months earlier, but he was called upon with a very difficult and important task to be the mourner-in-chief. The country looked to him for solace, and he did an extremely admirable job. Now, it's interesting, in just speaking to people, that a couple of questions that I had in the past few days is, where is Grant's tomb? So where is it in the city? So I wanted to kind of frame that for those that haven't been there. So this is a map of New York City from 1885. This is downtown. The Statue of Liberty is right around over there in the water. This is downtown where the World Trade Center is. If you go uptown now, if anyone's been to New York City, you probably went to the Empire State Building, you probably went to Broadway. It's kind of like that area. This is the Madison area, shopping area that you might go to, Rockefeller Center. Over here is Central Park. In 1885, most of the population, as you can see, this map is from 1885, most of the population was downtown. New York was still a much smaller city than everyone knows today. Now, all like the rich swells would have lived in this area up here. There was a lot of mansions in the Midtown area. So where's Grant's tomb? Not even on the map. It's in Riverside Park. At that point, it was mostly farmland, cottages, little hamlets. One reporter, it says that there's more goats than people in Riverside Park. How can you possibly put Grant there? But let me next go to why it's Riverside Park. Again, I want to talk about people. So the first person that I want to talk about is the New York City Mayor Grace. And Grace is one of the third reasons that Grant's tomb is located in New York City. So Grace was the first Irish and first Catholic mayor. He was a conservative Democrat, just like Grover Cleveland, in a time when all politics, but specifically New York City Democrat politics, was really known for corruption, the Tammany Hall machine. But Grace was conservative. Grace was a reformer, so against the corruption of the era. Now, he had also aggressively lobbied the family for the honor of hosting Grant's tomb. There was a lot of cities that wanted to have the honor of hosting Grant's tomb. There was Washington, D.C., there was Philadelphia, there was Illinois. And most of the people in the country felt that Grant should be on national ground, that he should be in Arlington Cemetery, he should be in West Point. But Mayor Grace was very aggressive. On the day that Grant died, first thing that Grace did was fire off a telegram to Mount McGregor. I'm very sorry, Miss Grant. Please consider having your Grant buried in New York City. He was very aggressive the day that Grant had died. Offered to take the family on a tour to see all different sites. He also, and so the reason that he was pushing for Riverside Park was because he wanted that to become more of a cultural and social center of the city. He wanted to keep pushing the population north, and he felt that would be the magnet that would bring them there, that people would flock to that area. Didn't quite happen that way. He also very quickly formed the Grant Monument Association, which included Gilded Age elites, Chester Arthur, former President Chester Arthur, J.P. Morgan, John Jacob Astor, Cornelius Vanderbilt, an honorary position for President Grover Cleveland. And their task was to create a magnificent monument fitting for Grant. Now, the other man that I want to mention, who was also on the Grant Monument Association, is the secretary, Richard Theodore Greener. Now, Greener was the first African-American graduate of Harvard University, a prominent attorney, and also dean of the Harvard Department of Law. In his own words, he had said that he had political relations with Grant and enjoyed his friendship during his last illness. Now, Greener was perhaps given the most important position, which was secretary and treasurer of the Grant Monument Association, because he was the one that was going to need to lead the fundraising efforts. So once again, we look to history. What sort of tomb would be built for Grant? So this is George Washington's two tombs. He was placed in a temporary one, the only president to be in a temporary tomb longer than Grant, but this was really his family's decision, not his city's. So you see very humble crypts for the early presidents. Here we have Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Again, if they're on their family estates or on Monticello and Montpelier, but if you saw these in a cemetery, you really wouldn't look twice. Now, the interesting thing about James Madison is his grave was completely uncovered for 21 years, just a mound of dirt. Didn't even put a tombstone on it until local citizens decided to chip in money to place a monument there for him. And by the time they did it, they didn't even know where Madison was buried anymore. They had to literally dig him up again to find out where to put the tombstone. But things started to change, especially after the Civil War, when we entered the Gilded Age. And all those hesitations about Roman architecture and any sort of classical influences on art and on architecture were kind of went by the wayside during the Gilded Age. Here's Abraham Lincoln's tomb in Springfield, Illinois. It was about 100 feet, and then it was added to later on. It was erected 1874, so kind of like right at the beginning of the Gilded Age. And then here we have, unfortunately, the second president assassinated in 16 years, James Garfield, this massive Gothic structure that's in a cemetery in Cleveland, Ohio. So the Grant Monument Association knew that their tomb needed to be bigger, more ambitious, bolder, more expensive than anything that had ever been built before, because Grant was a Gilded Age hero. So a monumental tomb, as they had intended on, cost a monumental amount of money to build. Now one of the members of the Grant Monument Association very quickly put a target number out there of $1 million that they were going to raise, like twice as much as the Garfield and the Lincoln tombs put together. But they figured Grant was such a hero, people would gladly donate their money. And people did. People sent in their nickels and dimes. Children held bake fairs, and they ran games, and they sent their $1.50 into the Grant Monument Association. As well, there were baseball games. So they were very creative with their fundraising. Here is a ticket from a baseball game from Albany, admission 25 cents, and then it's going to the Grant Monument Fund. So very ambitious, very generous, but 25 cents, $1.50 bake sales, this isn't going to get us to $1 million anytime soon. And very quickly, there was other sources too, money that were coming in. Very quickly, the Grant Monument Association had raised about $100,000. And it seemed like, all right, we're on the right path. But then money started to fall off. And we're going to get more to that later on. Besides the fundraising, there was also the efforts to what sort of tomb would be built for Grant. Because people wanted to know, if they're going to donate their money, they want to know what they're donating towards. There was a couple of design competitions. Most of the entrants were lambasted in the newspaper as ugly. There was one with, because electricity had just been built, there was a couple that put the largest skylight in the world on the top. There was like a 600-foot structure that was imagined. So there was several failed design competitions. Finally, in 1890, now 5 years, the Grant Monument Association finally settled on a design. And it was by John Hemingway Duncan. And this is his design. If you've been to Grant's tomb, you know, I can see some of it in there, but it's not quite the same. Duncan had envisioned, because there was no public transportation to get to this tomb, because it was so remote, like in the hinterlands of New York, he figured most people are going to go there by the Hudson River. They're going to take a boat. So he envisioned this massive walkway, prominent walkway going down to the Hudson River. Now, once again, it's a story of people, and I'm just going to very briefly talk about these two people, because by 1892, the Grant Monument Association, despite choosing a design, was struggling, and they were struggling bad. I mentioned that within several months, they'd raised about $100,000. 7 years later, their bank account was about $150,000. They'd raised about $50,000 in the last 7 years. People just weren't donating to it anymore. It's kind of considered like a lost cause. There was resentment and sabotage by pretty much everyone outside of New York City, because there was increasing anger that New York City doesn't deserve to be the burial place of Grant. Not only New York City, but a park, not a cemetery. This just doesn't make sense. There was also competing efforts. Right away, by this point, it's hard to imagine. 1885, when Grant died, there wasn't even a public statue of Grant. So all of a sudden, after Grant dies, there's all these efforts, other Grant monument associations, including one in St. Louis, competing for dollars. After a while, people weren't even quite sure what they were donating to. There was also inattention and political infighting within the GMA, the Grant Monument Association. I mentioned the big names that were on the board: J.P. Morgan, John Jacob Astor, Cornelius Vanderbilt. These were huge names, but they were also busy. These were the robber barons of the Gilded Age. Very quickly, their attentions turned to their railroads and to their banks and to their steel industries, and they really weren't paying attention to Grant's tomb anymore. There was also congressional efforts to move the tomb from New York City. After all these years, all right, New York City, you had your chance, you're falling down on the job, let's move Grant elsewhere. Let's move him to national grounds. And it had really become a pariah where people just didn't want to donate to it. So in steps these two. First is Horace Porter. Horace was Grant's aide-de-camp and a very good friend of his. There was kind of like a political overthrow, a coup d'etat, if you will, where Porter had taken over the Grant Monument Association, gotten rid of all the dead weight that he saw in there, and brought on his own folks. He changed the board from 30 people to 99 people. They were all friends of his. And Porter was appalled that after 7 years that there was so much stagnation. They weren't able to get this massive tomb that Grant deserved, that the country deserved, barely off the ground. Now, Porter was the public face. The other man is this kind of shady character here, Edward F. Craden. Now, he was from Chicago. He had, after Porter had taken over the presidency of the GMA, he got this note, or somehow he got in touch with Cragen, or Cragen got in touch with him. Every book you read kind of has this different account of how they got in touch. Now, he was from Chicago. They call him like a wheeler dealer. He wasn't so much of a Grant fan, but he was big on raising money. He had raised money in Illinois to celebrate George Washington's statewide birthday, and had also very successfully raised money for the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition that was going to be held the next year in 1893. So with Porter as the public face, Cragen as doing like the machinations from behind, they came up with a strategy to play on New Yorkers' pride and to say, hey, the whole country thinks that we can't build this tomb. Let's show them wrong. Let's show what New Yorkers can do. And they came up with committees that would go out to almost every industry that you can think of. They were going to restaurants. They were going to banks. They were going to coffee houses all over, to luggage industry, to book publishers. They had set up tins in restaurants and in hotels to raise money. All of a sudden, Grant's tomb went from a pariah to like this cause célèbre, where people were just opening up their wallets to donate to it. In a matter of 2 months, where $150,000 had been raised before, these two and everyone they had working with them managed to bring the account to about $500,000. Well then enough to complete a stripped-down version of what Duncan had envisioned. So construction went underway. Even after construction started, first they had a target date to finish 1895. That kind of came and went. 1896, 1897. There were still struggles. It was never easy for Grant's tomb. There was stoneworkers' strikes. This was the Gilded Age. People were striking all over the place. There was a panic of 1893, the biggest financial calamity in American history, because they didn't know about the Great Depression coming later. In 1893, this was the worst that it could possibly be. Millions of people out of work. And there was still the congressional efforts to move Grant's tomb. Even though it started, you know what, it took you so long to get going, we're not giving up yet. We still want to move Grant's tomb. But they persevered. 1897, April 27th, so the anniversary is coming up in 2 days. Grant's birthday. This would have been Grant's 75th birthday. In 2 days, it'll be Grant's 199th birthday. They finally finished his tomb. And what they created was the largest tomb in American history before or since. It's this magnificent neoclassical structure. It has these 10 impressive Doric columns in the front. It's 150 feet tall, which is only 1 foot shorter than the Statue of Liberty. I wish they would have just pushed it like 2 more feet so they can just pass that. It was 8,100 cubic feet. It's the largest tomb, again, in American history. And it's as majestic inside and outside. It's really a secular presidential cathedral, if you will. Really, if you haven't been there, it's very awe-inspiring to step inside. It was also the largest fundraising effort ever in American history up to this point. 600,000 people, or I'm sorry, $600,000 was donated by 90,000 people. Some had written checks for $5,000. Some had sent in their dimes or their pennies. But 90,000 people had donated to this effort. And you can't really see it in this picture. You can't see anything in this picture here. But one of the most impressive features is carved right above the entrance that are, again, Grant's 4 words, "Let us have peace." So the tomb was still a symbol of reunification after all these years, because the country still needed it by 1897. It became the #1 tourist attraction in New York City. And if anyone's been to New York City, you know there's a lot of tourist attractions in New York City. And again, consider how remote that this is. The #1 tourist attraction in New York City. Between 500,000 and 600,000 people visited every year. Also, international visitors would come to it. When dignitaries from England or from Japan or from France would come visit, Grant's tomb was a must-see stop. And they would decorate the tomb. If anyone seen on TV or been there, the Empire State Building right now, they'll light it up to celebrate different events, light it up in different colors. That's what they did to Grant's tomb. They would decorate it with the colors of international visitors. I also should have mentioned, going back to the dedication, there was a very important symbol of reunification that took place there. Julia Grant was sitting side by side with one of her newest best friends, which was Verena Davis, the widow of former Confederate President Jefferson Davis. And I know we have Bertram Davis right here, Bertram Hayes Davis right here, who is a descendant of Jefferson Davis. So just think about that. The president of the Confederacy, his widow is sitting side by side with the victorious general of the Union. It was really that symbol of reunification just permeated throughout this tomb's history. And even after the tomb was completed, it was also an important site for reunification. Here's an image from the newspapers of the time with a Confederate soldier, a Confederate soldier putting his hand on the sarcophagus along with a Union soldier. Over the years, there would be ceremonies that were held with Confederate veterans and Union veterans that would gather there. And just think about that. African Americans would gather there to pay their respects, to pay their homage to Grant. Confederates, Union. It was really the one place in the country that, with all of the difficulties, all can gather to pay their respects to this one great man. And it was also other people identified with the tomb, with Grant's struggle for freedom and liberty. And here is an image from 1914 where the women's suffrage movement had gathered at the tomb to protest for women's rights, and for women's rights to vote. And they felt Grant's tomb was the right place to make that statement. It was also featured in movies. This is a 1905 film from Thomas Edison where this poor sap puts an ad in the paper he's single, he wants to meet women, so he puts this ad in the paper, "Come meet me at the most prominent site in New York City in 1905, which was Grant's tomb." And it's a very silly film, but you can look it up on YouTube. Probably guess it, like 50 women show up there, and he, for some reason, gets scared. That wouldn't bother me. But, so well, when I was single, it wouldn't bother me. So he starts running away, and then, like, the next 10 and a half minutes of this 11-minute film is just him running all throughout New York City with them chasing him. But it kind of helps show what an important site that this was. It was featured in advertisements. It was featured on postcards. Now, postcards was a budding industry at the time, and Grant's tomb was one of the most popular images. So these postcards would be sent all around the world, and people would see it, and I want to come see Grant's tomb when I come to New York City. And even today, there's an incredible amount of international visitors that go to Grant's tomb. The last time that I visited, of the 18 names that were on the registry, I think 16 of them had been from international places. But then, towards the middle of the century, the middle of the 1950s, things began to change. First was the lost cause ideology. So that had started in the South shortly after the Civil War, that had kind of reframed the war, not a battle over slavery, but a battle of the Southern way of life, a battle for states' rights. By the early 1920s, that wasn't just a Southern belief, it kind of started to permeate throughout the North and all throughout the country. And as that ideology took hold and that thought process, Lee's reputation started to go up, Grant's reputation started to go down. And Grant, who had been the hero, who was beloved throughout the country, and if you saw Ulysses Grant Dietz's talk yesterday, you heard him talk about how Grant's reputation had suffered during that period, and he was known as a lucky general, a butcher, he was a drunk, he was a corrupt president. Just every insult in the world became attached with Grant. And as Grant went down and as the Civil War generation died off, 1956 was the last Civil War veteran that had died. This was right around the time that Groucho Marx uttered his famous phrase, "Who's buried in Grant's tomb?" So it kind of, if you put it in that context, it kind of takes on a little more meaning, where maybe years before, Groucho Marx would have said that, and people would have been, hey, you can't turn Grant's tomb into a punchline. This is the most beloved figure in history. But in that context, although Groucho, I'm sure, meant no harm, it had kind of personified or kind of just really helped crystallize what was happening to Grant's reputation during the middle of the century. Now, in the 1960s, things really began to take a turn. Now, the location of Riverside Park is kind of like on the outskirts of Harlem. It was a pretty rough area at the time. So throw in the fact that Grant was a disregarded figure by many in American history. It's in an area that is way off the map, and even today, that's not just 1885. There isn't too much reason to go that far north in New York City. The tourists coming into the city isn't good. Like, you're never going to like turn a corner just wandering throughout the city and see Grant's tomb. You really got to try to go see it. And also Grant's tomb was in a park, remember. It wasn't in a cemetery. And this park in New York City in the 60s, a lot of the parks became pretty dangerous. There was more gang activity than tourists in that area. So starting in the 1960s, Grant's tomb became to be, unfortunately, regularly vandalized, spray painted, desecrated. Tourists stopped going there. I mentioned 600,000 people had gone there during its heyday. Now, about 30,000 would go, and that's the official number. It's probably not even that high. Just people were staying away from Grant's tomb. Even people that worked there weren't going to Grant's tomb. It had ended up going from 7 days a week to about 3 days a week where it would stay open. The inside was dirty. There was no money being put into restoration efforts. Weeds were growing on the outside. Homeless were using it at night. There was no security at nights. Pretty much every crime you can think of and every horrible sort of thing that can pop into your mind without getting too graphic was taking place at Grant's tomb. And the city had gone downhill too. I mean, this was really not just at Grant's tomb, but it was really happening much worse there at Grant's tomb than happening in other areas of the city. If anyone happened to be in New York City in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, there were some pretty rough areas there. And this is the reason why my father wouldn't have taken us to Grant's tomb, because he was probably really concerned with our safety, and it was not a place that you would have brought young kids to at the time. It was a dangerous area. So the low point really took place on a May morning in 1993. Workers came in to the site in the morning. Every morning they were used to cleaning litter away or cleaning drug paraphernalia or picking up the whiskey bottles or whatever. They saw just horrible things that they needed to clean up without getting too graphic on the stoop. And then they looked up and they saw that someone had raised a garbage pail on the flagpole in front of Grant's tomb. It was almost like the dregs of society had raised the pirate flag that we are taking over this area. And if there was a rock bottom for Grant's tomb, it was that day in 1993. Once again, there was congressional efforts to, first it started out at the state level. Illinois was one of the states. Ohio also chimed in to please move the body out of New York City. You're not doing a good job at taking care of this important historical figure's remains. Started out at the state level, it went to the congressional level to remove Grant's body. And once again, it's a story of people. First person that I want to mention is Frank Scaturro. Now, Frank Scaturro was a young law student who happened to be going to Columbia University, which is like a stone's throw from Grant's tomb. Frank had always been interested in the presidents, and particularly Grant, but he just happened to go to Columbia just by serendipity. So, of course, he ended up going to Grant's tomb, and what he saw there horrified him. Frank is a very cerebral person, maybe is a good way to put it. So very analytical person. So he decided, I'm gonna kind of like work the hierarchy here. I'm gonna notify my superiors. I'm gonna do some research. I'm gonna go into the archives. And what he found is that this desecration had really started from the National Park Service when they had first taken over in the late 50s, that they were destroying artifacts. And so he notified his superiors. I mean, obviously they knew what was going on. They can see it. And then he wrote a 325-page report that he sent all over the country. He sent it to the mayor. He sent it to the governor. He sent it to President Clinton. And he had managed to start getting some exposure. He was on an NBC morning show and then in the New York Times. But there's also one other individual that was key in this, and this is Ulysses Grant Dietz. I think that's perfect. And I was so blessed to be able to interview Frank and Ulysses for my book. And if Frank, hope you don't mind if I say this, if Frank was the head of the effort, then Ulysses was the heart of the effort. Because this wasn't just a president's tomb to him. This was his great-great-grandfather's tomb. And he had gone on his own journey of discovery, which he had talked about yesterday, so I won't repeat. But along with Frank, Ulysses became very vocal, and they sued the city. And thanks to their efforts, it's one thing to turn your back on a Frank Scaturro. It's a little different when the family is involved, leading this effort. And it really became not just a city embarrassment, but a national embarrassment. So, this is Ulysses without the beard there, so it might be a little tough to recognize. But to make a long story short, their efforts were successful. They got the National Park Service to add security, to clean up the site, to make it once again a respectable site worth visiting. This is from the dedication in 1997, and I just want to quote Ulysses here. He had said, "I believe that Grant's tomb can easily inspire that same sense of sympathy and hope and pride in a modern-day audience, an audience far bigger and far more complicated than the one a century ago." And I think that's incredibly important. We talk about the reunification and reconciliation. Gosh, I think we can use that now. And I think Grant's tomb is just really is a site that once again, that I think people from all strata of society, from all political sides can go to celebrate. Today, it's back to its former glory. It's like it's risen from the ashes, just like Grant's reputation. It's amazing how the story of the tomb and the story of Grant kind of run parallel. If you look at or if you believe the rankings of the presidency or the rankings of the president that come out every 8 years, 1990, when Grant's tomb was kind of at its lowest, Grant was considered the fourth from the worst president. All of that lost cause mythology had really sunk in, even with many historians. Over the last couple years, historians have taken a much closer look at the Reconstruction era. And they've looked hard at what Grant had tried to do during that era and what he did do, that he crushed the KKK in a noble effort to have African Americans be able to exercise their rights of citizenship in the South that they were being denied. He struggled for Indian rights, for African American rights. Ultimately, many of those didn't go as far as he wanted. But now, Grant's reputation, again, just like Grant's tomb, he's now right in the middle of the pack. I think he's like partnered up with Grover Cleveland somewhere around there, like 22, 23. It's an astronomical rise that has happened to Grant's reputation as well as Grant's tomb. So like the man, Grant's tomb also has an important and fascinating history, and people should know its story. With that, I thank you.